Before I get into the content of this video, I wanted to take a quick second just to point out that this video is going to be part of a series of maybe 2 or 3 videos. So if you like this one, then be sure to follow along for the follow-ups that are going to be coming in the next couple weeks. In the wisdom of my youth, I'd often wondered what it is about the experience of growing older that makes you stop caring about being cool or fashionable. Like, why do older people all wear the same style blouses and golf shirts and slacks and sneakers? It's like you reach a certain age and there's some secret of society that's ready to hand you your uniform, and nobody in that age demographic seems to resist the impulse. Of course, there's a need to be comfortable, so I get that you're not going to want to be wearing form-fitting pants or uncomfortable shoes, but there's no reason comfortable clothing needs to look so inane. Now that I've reached a phase in life where the qualities of being middle-aged are fast approaching, I think I'm starting to understand why this evolution in our personal priorities happens. First, I became a husband, and then a homeowner, and then a business owner, and then a father. And my mind space has become so consumed by the priorities of the life that I'm building and the people that I care about within it, that the cares of my former life that were focused on knowing what's cool and current seem completely hollow and not worth competing with the priorities and the people that do occupy my focus. And the longer this phase of life goes on for, the easier it becomes for me to imagine that one day I will turn around and realize that I've disregarded cultural fashions for so long that reclaiming them seems impossible and not really worth it anyways. See, the older you get, the more your values shift from focus on self and superficiality to others and society. And this is something that I would argue happens primarily through the experience of raising your own family. The experience of life forces you into a process where increasing responsibilities pressure you into growing in maturity and just becoming a better person. And so too, you will feel pressured to change your values to adapt to those growing pressures. Simply put, you'll learn to anchor yourself in timeless wisdom and virtues because that's the only way you'll survive those pressures. So the older you get, the more you'll move away from values that are focused on fitting in and being cool to values that are grounded in objective and transcendent truths. And so eventually the prospect of putting on my leisure suit and orthopedic shoes and spending my time complaining about modern culture doesn't seem so hard to imagine. And this got me thinking about another strange phenomenon that is really hard to reconcile with any reasonable justification. It's the fact that our modern media heavily favors a younger audience. Our movies, our TV shows, our music, our art, and especially our advertising are all aimed at connecting with a young audience. One study I read about recently was trying to make sense of the fact that only 10% of advertising dollars are aimed at a demographic that is 55 or older, even though that's where the greatest deposit of wealth lies. Now, if there's one thing I know about the advertising industry, it's that they're not stupid. They wouldn't carelessly make this mistake. So it begs the question, why are they skipping this demographic in favor of a younger audience that has less money? We don't realize how pervasive advertising is because we're so acclimatized to it. But in reality, it underpins and influences so much of our society. We like to think that we have this understanding with the advertising industry wherein they remain confined to certain times and places like commercial breaks and billboards, and then they leave us alone when we're preoccupied with our TV shows or our internet usage. In reality, advertising sneaks into and influences so much more. For example, when we talk about companies like Google and Facebook, we refer to them as tech companies, but actually they're advertising companies. That's the primary source of revenue. Their fundamental purpose is to convince us to use their tools so that they can sell our attention to advertisers. Without advertising, neither of those two companies would bother producing their technology. It is what motivates everything that they do. Why else would Facebook staff be composed of so many people who are experts in human psychology as opposed to, say, computer programming? Another experience I can relay through my own professional work was the discovery of a website that was targeted mostly towards potential investors and advertisers. It was a site for a parent media company that was used to detail all of the media properties that they owned that they would then offer to advertisers to spread their message through. Now, these properties were all TV shows and news publications. Again, we think of these things as having their own end. So the newspaper's end is to deliver the news, and the means by which it does that is selling advertising. In reality, it's the reverse. Their end is to sell advertising, and their means is by getting our attention long enough by the news to deliver the ads. Let that sink in a little bit. Our main sources of news, information, and social interaction are offered to us in the hopes that they can redirect our attention towards our consumer appetites. So how do they do it? By conditioning us with a set of values that makes their job easier. Specifically, they've been conditioning us for generations to care about fashions and trends, or more simply, to care about being cool. And this isn't hard to trace. Our culture and our values have dramatically changed over the past 70 years. We've gone from believing in common and objective morals and truths to more relativistic ones, as in what's right for you might not be right for me. We've gone from holding up and glamorized people who represented nobility and virtue to becoming obsessed with people who are easy to look at but are vapid in every other way. This shift has occurred coincidentally right alongside the rise and dramatic spread of media built upon advertising. For generations, they've been using their messaging to convince us to let go of ideals that made it harder for them to sell us stuff we don't need. And in place, they've been convincing us to adopt a value system that is obsessed with being fashionable and cool. Think about it. A person who cares about being a good steward of the resources and money they've been given in life. A person who cares about wise and prudential judgment. A person that cares about being disciplined in the face of temptation, which are timeless traditional values, is not the kind of person who is easily going to run out and spend $1,000 on a new iPhone just because it now comes in rose gold and will make their friends jealous. A person who cares primarily about being cool, however, is helpless before a slick marketing campaign that promises to satisfy their need to be cool and cutting edge if they just get the latest model. Our obsession with being cool has been instilled in us by people who care nothing about our happiness. Our values have been sold to us by people who don't care about actual moral values, as long as we're buying what they're selling. How else would you explain the phenomenon of our obsession with being cool and up to date? An obsession that everyone grows out of as they age because the experience of life teaches them that it's not the path to happiness and fulfillment. If everything in life is trying to teach us that that's futile and basically BS, then where does that idea come from in the first place? It comes from the fact that 90% of our advertising dollars are spent on making our young people, who are the most vulnerable to this kind of messaging, into an easy sell. And they can do this because advertising is what motivates all of our media, and our young people are paying the most attention to it. We spend hours watching TV shows, hours on our phones, hours on the internet. And even when we think we're doing work or research on search engines, there it is influencing us with its message. If you're not convinced, I want to share one last anecdote with you. In a previous video of mine, I mentioned a radio documentary I listened to about the history of the modern advertising industry. They traced its advent to the period following World War I. Leading up to the war, the American people wanted nothing to do with Europe's conflict, but the government knew that they would have to get involved at some point. But they didn't want to go against the public opinion, so they hired thousands of writers and poets and musicians and thinkers to come up with a strategy that would convince the American public that going to war was a good idea. And they succeeded in doing that. The documentary goes on to explain that these same creatives went on to set up shop on Madison Avenue in New York to apply their new trade to the consumer market. If they could find ways to convince people to sail off to a foreign land, to live in poisonous trenches and risk getting blown up for years, how hard do you think it would be for them to use that same influence to convince us to buy a can of soda or to vote for a politician? We're kidding ourselves if we think we're immune to that influence. I don't think the question of whether they could or not is relevant. I think it's a question of whether or not they would. And I'll leave that up to you to resolve. Thank you guys for watching that. If you enjoyed that, then please like it and share it and subscribe and come follow along for more content. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting the business that makes them possible. Holdsworth Design is a digital marketing and communications company that specializes in web design, print design, branding, videography, and all that kind of stuff. So, and this is with a special emphasis on churches and ministries as well. So if you know somebody that needs those services, then please consider passing that along to them, and check out the website, which is www.holdsworthdesign.com.